Thank you for taking a minute out. And I want to begin our conversation with the 4-year anniversary of this pandemic. How
Sure.
did you get through it, and how did it change you?
Yeah. So at the time, I was a consultant. I worked in downtown DC and I had recently been divorced. So thankfully that went through right before the pandemic. We went to court 2 months later, everything shut down. So very thankful about that. But I was actually living alone with just my dog. And so while I had a lot of flexibility in my schedule being a consultant, right, I never really pictured myself being someone who could be home 100% of the time, right? That 1 day a week, 2 days a week being home or being flexible was really nice. But the world shut down, and so I'm sitting in this tiny condo by myself with my dog trying to figure out how do I do all of the things that I used to do and not drive myself insane, right? I think I that's when I started my house plant collection. I did all of the really typical things, right? I started the sourdough starter.
Uh-huh.
I
Yep.
bought a fish, right? Like I was just trying to find all of these things to like entertain myself because I already am a big reader, right? So picking up something like reading really wasn't adding to my day. But I kind of got through it with piecing together the pieces of my life through online versions of it, right? So at the time, I was a really big CrossFitter. My CrossFit gym allowed us to come in, take some equipment. They started doing virtual Zoom classes. So while it's not the same experience, at least I had an outlet to start to work out.
Right.
I started to run a little bit more. And then, friends who were sort of in the area, you form your little bubble, right? You
Yeah.
were like, I think we can do this, or I'll sort of wave to you from over here. But sort of piecing together a bunch of different hobbies of mine that I didn't have time for was how I got through that initial piece. And being in DC, I think, was very helpful because, again, I was so close to a lot of people versus, now that I'm out in Virginia, that would probably be a little bit harder, right? The distance, you can't just do a drive by and wave to people. You'd have to drive to your neighbors or elsewhere. So being in DC, I think at that point was very helpful.
So I'm curious, the rest of us that live around the country feel the whole political weight of everything, signs and all these things. How magnified is it being up in that DC area, especially when it comes to like this year with election time? Is it just over the top, or do you not experience what we experience around the rest of the country?
Since I moved out of the district at the end of 2020 and moved into Virginia, I'm 20 whole miles away, right?
Yeah.
I've sort of separated myself a little bit. And the part of the politics that I feel, so I work for a government contractor, as most of us do in the area. I feel more of the budget constraints, right? We keep going through continuing resolution, continuing resolution, continuing resolution. So we're always on this hyper awareness that, any of our contract work could stop. We're like, why can't we just pass a budget? Like that's sort of the
Mhm.
political feel that we have. But when I was in DC proper, I mean, I think DC is a very transient place, right? That's the nice and bad thing I think about living in DC. The average tenure of a resident in DC is only 7 years, and that is because of the political cycle, right? People come in, they work for an administration, 1 to 2 cycles out, they're out and they're back home. So those of us who live in the area long term, you see this sort of cycle of people
Yeah.
come in and come out, which really does impact the vibe of the city. I would say anyone who lives in the area full time is a little bit outside of that bubble, right? We're not so politically charged on either side, very aware of the issues that are going on because we have a lot of colleagues or friends who come in to work, on the Hill, in Congress, what have you. But the daily person who lives in DC, right? Again, a lot of us work for the federal government, which is sort of outside of that political space. So I'd say we're aware,
Yeah.
but maybe sort of immune a little bit
Gotcha.
because that's such
Okay.
a daily piece of our life.
That's interesting. I'm just curious, every city has its flavor, and obviously DC is a big magnet for the whole political agenda that happens in the world. I mean, we're the epicenter. So let me ask you this. On paper, it's very clear what you do, but let's get to the heart and soul of it. I'm going to put you in front of a bunch of third graders. It's career day.
Sure.
All right.
Sure.
One of the kids is curious and says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" How would you answer that child?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is probably good for my mom too, right? Because I doubt she knows what I do. But anyway, so I'm currently the vice president of marketing communications at a government contractor, RIVA Solutions. So I have actually a really fun job. And even though it is in the government contracting space, which people don't typically think of as a creative, fun company to market or communicate, we take a totally different approach, right? So while we're doing very serious work with the government, helping them modernize their IT systems, get them off legacy systems, improve the user experience, I have the honor of leading a really cool creative team that pulls in a lot of best practices and campaign work from the private sector. We also have a mascot, which is an alpaca, right? So we do all of our internal communications to make sure that our employees feel welcome, they feel part of the herd, as we call it. So yeah, I just get to talk about the company and the work that we do in both, for our employees to make sure that they understand what all of their coworkers are doing on a daily basis and feel connected and a part of our community, but also get to advertise the great work that we do in the larger universe.
I don't know a lot of people that are affected because we hear about all these spending budgets that don't get passed or there's a government shutdown. And a lot of us, we know that there's military people, but there's a lot of contractors too. That has to be a real razor's edge to live that way in your life, where you're just not sure how it's going to all pan out.
Yeah, it kind of depends cycle to cycle, right? So the last actual government shutdown was the longest one, and that was in 2018. And at the time, I was at a different contractor and I was on the billable side of the house. So I was working directly with our government clients. And that was a really scary time because I think the government was shut down for like 30, 40 days.
Oh, yeah.
It was the longest one in history. And it's all sort of based on your contract and what your agency has the leeway to do. And so at the time, I was supporting both NASA and Department of Justice. But the company that I worked for had made all of these sort of financial decisions at the end of the year prior to like prepay their rent, buy new furniture, right? Kind of get rid of some of their tax liabilities. And so, because of that, when the government shut down, they weren't as liquid on cash as they typically would have been. And so, there was this huge pressure on the consultants to bill 40 plus hours, bill every single minute you have, bring in as much cash. And if you couldn't maintain at least, I think, 35 hours of billable work a week, you were on leave without pay, you were out. And, typically contractors do get paid back, but it's like a very long stretch of time. Maybe it's 6 months out, maybe it's 10 months out. And sometimes that's the company, and the company doesn't have any reason to pay you back, right? So it's just kind of this weird place depending on where you are, especially if you're at a smaller company that, isn't this big giant that like, can float you.
Yeah.
And so you kind of just panic. You're like, how do I work all these hours? How do I keep myself afloat? Right. Because again, DC is such an expensive area. I've got bills, I've got a mortgage, I've got all of these things. At the time, I didn't have a family, so it was a little bit easier for me as a solo person. But yeah, really scary to not know that your next paycheck is going to come in or not, because people are arguing about it on the Hill. So this time around, it's been a different experience. I'm at a different company, right? I'm in a different role, and so there's not as much pressure for our contractors to bill because we're in a different contract structure, right? So some agencies have money to keep floating, and it's in your contract that you can keep going. So it really just sort of depends on the situation. But yeah, it can be really stressful on the contractors. The feds get paid back
Yeah.
always,
Of
but the
course. Of course.
contractors,
Yep.
it's a question, right?
Like a casino, house wins. So let me ask you
Right,
this.
always.
Always. So let me ask you this. What did you want to be in the third grade? What was your dream to grow up and become?
Uh, Probably an author.
Okay.
And I'm not that far off of it, I will say. I think that's why when I finally figured out what I wanted to do when I grew up, right at like 26 or whenever I actually got adulting, marketing is one of those things that does have a very heavy writing component to it, creative
Yeah.
component to it. So I am able to leverage that skill, and it still is on my bucket list one day to write a book. I would absolutely love to go back and get my doctorate and be a business school professor. When I was in business school, all the adjunct professors were the best ones that I had, right? They weren't teaching you theory from a book about how to do business or leadership. They were actually bringing you real examples. And so I'd love to be able to pass that on to the next generation. So, maybe a decade from now, 2 decades from now, go back, get my doctorate, and really be able to focus on teaching and writing would be the golden dream goal.
So as a reader, what's your favorite book?
That's a good question. It kind of depends on the genre. I would say my overall favorite book is The Stranger, which is kind of a weird choice, I guess, unless you're into the classics. But it's one of those books that by Camus that, whenever I hit a period in my life where I'm feeling like a little bit out of control or you're hitting burnout, it's one of those books that I've read probably 5 or 6 times in my life when I hit those weird periods where the whole concept of the book is existentialism, right? Like
Yeah.
life has no meaning. You have to sort of give life meaning, right? So it's one of those things that I'll sit down. It's a very quick read. I'll read it and I'll be like, you're overthinking this, right? Like this is a phase in your life. This is a period. It will pass. Give life new meaning, right? So it's just one of those books on my shelf that I will go back to when I sort of hit a critical pivot point or sort of an overwhelming time in my life to remind me that, at the end of the day, it's all a little bit meaningless, right? We have to create our own meaning. And maybe it's time to take a step back.
Yeah, that is a great book. So let me ask you this. Who's been a hero or an inspiration in your life?
Ooh, um, that's a good question. I'll go like an unoriginal answer, and I'll probably just say my dad,
Yeah, right.
right? But I mean, all things considered, right? My parents are both the middle child of five, didn't grow up with a whole lot. And when I was very, very young, my dad sort of walked out from his company and started his own company. And I've always sort of taken that and seen what he was able to do and still running the company and still has a lot of those original employees with him. So just his work ethic and his ability to sort of design and build the life that he wanted. I think I've taken a lot of those lessons myself. And while I'm not currently an entrepreneur, I have been in the past. I've been a business owner. I just have a lot of respect for what he was able to do coming from like barely graduating high school, right? With not a lot of money and a single his father passed away very early in his life. So just growing up with his siblings and his mom, I think it's really cool what he's been able to do. And I take a lot of those lessons with me every day.
So if you could meet one person alive on the planet right now that you find fascinating, very interesting, who would you love to meet and talk to?
One person who's alive. Oh, that's a good question. Um, hmm. Alive? I think she would just be like really fascinating and not because I believe in necessarily her lifestyle, but Miley Cyrus. I think
Yeah,
she's like a wildly talented individual, has gotten a lot of bad press. And I understand, growing up in the spotlight, that has a lot to do with sort of how you're shaped and how you behave as an adult. But I really enjoyed sort of seeing her sort of comeback, right? And just the covers and the music she's been able to put out recently has been phenomenal. She has a wonderful voice with so much versatility to it. And so I think it would just be cool to sit down with her and I think and like pick her brain and sort of get a little bit of insight into the crazy.
you should look, Joe Rogan did an interview with her, and I listened to it
Did
probably
he?
about
Okay.
6 months ago, and it was really I never really delved into her world, and it was fascinating, and she was talking about her dad being, like, off the grid. He has a flip phone. He lives
Hmm.
out in the middle of nowhere, doesn't have an internet connection. Like, he just totally was li he's, like, cut off from civilization, and it's fascinating because, I mean, I'm sure if you get to that point in your life where you're the focal point of every single photographer that wants to get a picture of you,
Right.
you just wanna retreat back, but anyways, yeah, her story's pretty fascinating, so it's a good interview. Um,
Mm.
so let me ask you this. Every day you wake up, you have a motivation to do your job and do the best job that you can do, but you also have to evolve as a human being. What is that motivation for you every day to do all of that?
Yeah. So I actually just was listening to a podcast, and I think it was Adam Grant. But he had one of my favorite Peloton instructors on, Robin, and they were talking about the concept of motivation, right, and how that was sort of a lie and it doesn't exist, and that motivation comes after you've already take action. And so I think that's kind of how I live my life, right? And especially coming off, so I just welcomed my first child 6 weeks ago, right? So
Nice.
postpartum, pregnancy, working full time, still keeping the gym schedule. It was very humbling and very difficult, right? You wake up 6 months pregnant and you're like, I don't want to go to the gym today, or I don't want to do this, right? And you have every excuse and every reason not to. But the level of dedication and sort of my why is because it's important to me. It makes me a better person. It makes me stronger. It makes me healthier for all the things that I want to do in life. And that's why I would consistently get up and do it, right? And so the motivation a lot of times is not there, right? you
Yeah.
you kind of have to take the first action and do something, and then the motivation comes afterwards. Because I've never regretted a workout, right? If I can get myself to the parking lot of the gym, walk in, I know I'm going to have a great day. So it's kind of how I live my life and orient my philosophy is you have to take that action to be able to earn the motivation.
Yeah, for sure. So what has been one of the best triumphant moments in your professional life so far?
Yeah. So a couple of years ago, we won a really large contract. And it had a cool name. Everything in the government has an acronym, right? So it was the acronym was BOSS. So I'm like, I can do something with this. I'm from New Jersey, so the boss to me is Bruce Springsteen.
Yeah,
And I was like, how do I build Bruce Springsteen into this campaign, right? So we sat on it for a while the contract was under protest, and about 18 months later, we realized we hadn't done anything with it, and we really needed to make a splash at this agency because they didn't really know who we were, right? But it was a really big opportunity for us to make some money. So I was on a walk with my dog, and I'm like coming up with this crazy concept, and I came up with the like bosses for boss hashtag. And I'm like, again, how do I get Bruce Springsteen and some of these pop culture bosses into this campaign just as something funny, right? Something a little bit different from the usual things that you would see from a government contractor. So it ended up when I talked to my team about it and kind of got some initial hesitation buy-in from like, okay, maybe we'll do this for an internal meeting, was not supposed to be something that we did externally. Um, we ended up creating an office parody video. And if you're a fan, there's that meme that it's like, it's happening. They're all running around sort of in the office. So
yeah,
that's kind of what we pull on, right? Because we finally got out of protest, the contract was awarded, we could start work. And so we had the CEO, we had a whole bunch of people participate in this video. And the intent of the video really truly was just to show it at an internal meeting with our partners to say, hey, thanks for waiting out this 18 months with us, right? We know this kind of sucked, but we're ready to get going. And everyone loved the video and kept asking me, hey, when are we going to share this? Like, when can I repost this? And I was like, never, right? Like, we're a government contractor. Like, this was supposed to be fun. This is an internal thing. I'm glad you liked it, but we didn't really intend to make this a full campaign. And so everyone was like, no, 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 you have to post this. You have to share this. So we kind of took a step back and said, it matches our culture. It matches our vibe. Let's do it. Let's see what happens. The worst that could happen is we delete it because it just didn't, hit the mark.
yeah.
And so we launched this video on LinkedIn and all of our platforms, and it was like took off. And for months, people were coming up to me in person being like, oh my God, I loved that video. That was so cool. And we started to see other contractors take sort of that appeal, right? Do something fun, pull in pop culture. I ended up being able to speak at a conference about innovation in marketing. I won an award for that. I mean, it exploded
That's
into
cool.
this thing where it was like, I never intended for this to
Yeah,
see the light of day beyond the 20 people that we were kind of had in that meeting. And it all stemmed from a walk from my dog, right? And like my
yeah,
love for Bruce Springsteen. So that was probably one of the coolest moments because, again, you think government contracting, not a fun creative space. But I've been able to land at a place and build a team that really has that leeway to do some creative, fun things that I wouldn't get at another contractor. And that's part of the reason why, I stay and I really like my
yeah.
job.
But that's the weird thing about social media. You can think and put all this energy into something that you think people are gonna like, but it's that
Yeah.
one thing that you just don't think is gonna take off. It's the unexpected that gets viral, that totally gets out
Hmm.
there. I remember that Harlem Shake thing where it was
Oh,
just a
yeah.
couple of kids in the dorm room or wherever, and it, like, became this viral sensation. Who would have known? It's just weird things. The collective psyche is a very strange organism whenever it gets together and makes something a big deal. Let me ask you this. What's the best advice you've ever gotten?
Uh, don't take other people's advice.
There you go.
That was probably the number one thing that, again, going through pregnancy last year and welcoming my daughter a couple weeks ago, you get a ton of unsolicited advice from like random strangers, people on the road, like everyone, right? Everyone has an opinion about what worked for them, what worked for their baby. And our COO came up to me at one point and said, he has one child who's grown now, and he said, I have like one piece of advice for you. He said, like, literally, don't listen to anybody. Like, you know your child the best. You will figure out how to parent what works for you and your husband. He's like, everyone's advice is crap. Don't take it. Just follow your gut, and you'll be fine.
Yeah. I remember the advice that I got when I had my son. He's 19 now. Was whatever you do, be honest.
Yeah.
Just whatever you do, even if you have to, because sometimes you have to save them from the reality of our world. Sometimes, at least don't lie. Don't put anything out there that's not true, but whatever you do, be as honest as you can be. which, I mean, that's the whole kindergarten adage. I mean, that's just good advice to anybody, you know.
Yeah, no, I love that. And all of the reading, I'm trying to still do the reading, right? So like
Yeah,
you have the knowledge and you do what you want with it. But that's kind of how I've been treating my daughter. I mean, she's like what, 6 full weeks old, right?
right.
Is be communicate with her, treat her like a little person. And my husband kind of thinks a little bonkers, but the other day he tried to offer her like a bottle or something and she shook her head no. And I said, she told you no. Like she
Yeah,
understands what you're doing. Like don't sort of downplay just because she's, can't communicate yet
yeah.
that she doesn't understand it. So just trying to be open and honest with her, even at this young age. Yeah, I think that's great
Yeah.
advice.
It's a big deal. So let me ask you this. If you had a dream tonight, you ran into the 18-year-old version of yourself, and you could give that younger version of you a piece of advice based on the wisdom you've gained so far, what advice would you impart on that young version of you?
Yeah. So probably don't do something because it's just like the next step or expected, right? I think I fell into that trap in my early 20s. So I got my undergrad degree in Boston and I'd always wanted to move to DC. My parents thought DC was this like very unsafe place. So they were very against me coming down here for college. Somehow Boston was a better choice. And so I interned in DC, right? And then, immediately moved back with no job to sort of make this dream happen for myself. Met my first husband very early into that. We started dating, we moved in very quickly. And then, maybe the relationship wasn't the best one, but we kind of hit that it's comfortable. And the next expected step is for us to get married, right? And so, I'm 26, we get married. And then by 29, I'm like, this is not for me, right? I hate this. Like every other part of my life, I've been able to achieve everything that I want. I got my master's degree, I've got a great job. But I come home and I'm like, you're my roommate. Like this isn't what I'm looking for. I'm approaching 30. I'd really like to have a family, but like this isn't it, right? Like you're not my person. I'm not going to make the situation worse by having children because that's not going to solve it, right? Like that's just going to make me resent you even more.
Yeah,
And so went through the process of like the difficult process of, mutually separating. And now I'm, remarried and very, very happy with that decision. I think you're more settled as a person in your 30s and understand what you want. So it's much easier for me to say, like, yes, you are my person, right? Not the first person. But I think if I had slowed down and like when I was 24, 25, right, going through this and thinking, like, I don't have to achieve that next step because it's expected, right? Take your own time, figure it out. If it doesn't feel right, it probably isn't, right? So don't commit to something or some person or some role just because, you feel the pressure that you have to get married, you have to take that job, you have to have that child. It's your life, it's your journey. Do it in your own time.
yeah, for sure. So at the end of the day, everyone sees you in a certain light, family, friends, clients, colleagues, but you run the show. What's your perception of you? Who do you think you are?
I don't take myself that seriously, but it's always really funny when you go back and like watch interviews or videos or get perceptions of other people where I do actually come off as a very serious person. Or I remember a couple of years ago, I watched an interview back and I was like, man, I sound like that. Like, I don't sound like that in my own head, right? Like,
Yeah,
I'm just like doing it, right? Like, always want to be out there meeting new people, trying new things, and like forming the life and sort of the freedom that I want to. But I guess I come off as sort of a very serious, accomplished person, which is not untrue, right? But it's just not the narrative that I have in my head and I'm always questioning why people take me so seriously or like put me in these like big spotlight spots. And then again, you go back and watch it and you're like, oh, that's
yeah,
why I
that's
give
right.
those vibes.
Yeah,
But yeah, that's not how I think about it at all, right? Everyone's making it up as they go along. So I'm
yeah,
really just trying to make the best decision for myself, now my family, and have fun, right? That's
yeah.
really what I'm trying to do.
Well, I guess that's kind of the backbone a little bit of the whole existentialist notion. Just kind of just let it go. Just like right now is now and just go with it. So let me ask you this. If anyone out there wants to learn more about you, reach out, anything about your world, where's the best place for them to go?
Yeah, the best place, quickest place to get a hold of me is probably LinkedIn. So Alex Stevens Love. Or if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what I'm doing on my new podcast, Mastering the Art of Failing is the new podcast that I started with my former business partner. We both decided, being new parents, this was absolutely the time to start something new.
Yeah.
So we just recorded episode 8 yesterday, so getting into that. But again, from that existentialist perspective, it's really cool to hear people talking about failure because that is such a part of my life that I sort of tuck away. But to have those important conversations about how do you learn from that, how do you grow from that, has been really cool to experience. Because life's not linear, and you have ups, you have downs, but as long as you're learning from it and figuring out what's the best, next step for me or how do I improve, failure should be celebrated.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the backbone of an entrepreneur. That's the backbone of growth and all of that. So I will put that in the show notes. Alex, it's been wonderful to get
Sure.
to know you. Thank you for your time today. Best of luck with being a mom, the podcast, and everything that comes your way. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. Take care.